Welcome to another edition of Peace Pipe TV. I have my lovely co-host here with me. Please introduce yourself.
Peace, everybody. I'm Phoenix Nadie. Thank y'all so much for being here.
We have a real treat for you today. I don't know who's more excited, me, her, or our guest herself. We have the lovely Doctor, Fatou. She has a lovely presentation for you today. I promise you, you are going to enjoy this. Without further ado, we're going to introduce the doctor. We're going to let her introduce herself, somebody who needs no introduction.
Hi, I'm Dr. Fatou Diarra. Some of your listening audience already knows me. My interest has been DNA for some time because I know that a lot of people, especially nowadays, they're doing ancestry DNA studies, and ancestry DNA can be a good thing, but it can be a bad thing. It can be a good thing if you understand it. It can be a bad thing if you don't understand it, particularly with our people here in the Americas. And especially now that a lot of our people are doing genealogical studies, and they're finding out that many of their ancestors were already indigenous here. We don't understand how to interpret these DNA tests. So I've taken a interest in studying why we have these type of genetic patterns, and that's what I enjoy explaining to people so they can have a better understanding of how to interpret these tests when they get these results.
That's
Absolutely.
awesome. So, do you have it? Let's let everybody know where we're streaming from so everybody can come over from these different platforms before we go into the full presentation with Dr. Fatou.
Absolutely.
So, we're here on we're here on YouTube. Are you on TikTok yet?
I'm not because actually my phone's about to die. So unless you have like a UPS cord, you know.
Yeah, I'll bring it to you.
Okay.
All right.
I can't wait for this. I saw the slides, so I am excited. 1 second, you all.
Mm-hmm. All right, sorry about that. So we're going to be streaming from YouTube. So if you're on Facebook, you want to come over to YouTube, come on over and chill with us there. Um, those of you who are going to be on TikTok, you guys can always come over to YouTube at Peace Pipe TV. And again, we always thank you guys so much for being here. Let's see, we have some comments already. We're going to put on the screen. Peace, Asada. Peace to Mama Nani. Shell. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and Dr. Fatou, are you ready to start your presentation?
Yes, so I'll just say next slide, like I did in the past when we are ready to move to the next slide.
Okay. That works. Let's go ahead and get this shared. All right. Are you guys able to see this okay?
Wait, are you asking me too?
Yes.
Yeah, I can see.
Okay.
All right. So the topic of this presentation is a deeper dive into African American and Caribbean DNA results, additional proof of our indigenous American and Moorish heritages. So before I move forward, I'm just going to do a brief summary of the prior points that I made when I was last on the show, because understanding the background information that I presented in my prior lecture will help the listening audience understand what I'm about to present today. So I will just take a few minutes to go over a few points that are very, very important. Okay, next slide. Is that okay? Yes, there you go. Okay, so number one, Pygmy, Khoisan, San, Bantu DNA are most ancient and they are global. Okay, number two, evidence of above is found in DNA of Polynesians who have 20 to 25% African DNA, which is similar to the African DNA from the Great Lakes area of Africa. We also call that Bantu type DNA. Otzi of Europe, the 5,000-year-old frozen mummy found in the Alps, also had both Pygmy and Bantu DNA. All I'm showing is the global nature of this DNA that's labeled African. Number four, the Lebanese sample, like other Levantine DNA, the primordial portion of that individual's DNA, which pretty much represents the DNA from the sample's area, contained Bantu, Pygmy, Khoisan, San, along with Mozambique, Yoruba, Mandinka, Igbo, and Akan matches. And I also mentioned Tyrone Lewis Cannon's scientific dissertation, which anybody can type into the search engine, and I suggest everyone reads it. And there, Tyrone Lewis Cannon talked about how 100%, almost 100% of his sample population of African Americans had both Native American and Southeast Asian markers, which represented Austronesian markers. And the significance of that has to do with the fact that Austronesians were the earliest seafarers, and the fact that almost 100% of us in North America possessed those markers meant that our forefathers had to be here to greet them. You can go to the next slide. The other point that I made that is important to understand before we move forward is that Bantu type DNA was the predominant type of DNA present in the Americas. Number 8, North African DNA is a modern creation, and by definition, it is a genetic group that is created from a combination of sub-Saharan African DNA, Southern European, and West Asian elements over a period of time. The other point that I made was Amizigh DNA, which is the correct term we call people in North Africa who are called Berbers, characteristically possess a similar pattern that we see in both so-called African Americans and Caribbean people, the 4 African genetic groups simultaneously. Number 10, the Amizigh pattern simultaneously contains Senegambian, Ghanaian/Mende, Yoruba or Nigeria, and a Bantu group with tiny Native American markers. It can also be Southeast Asian markers. Number 11, Igbo matching in the Caribbean and the United States, which shows up on 23andMe now, particularly from individuals from Montserrat, Antigua, Barbados, Jamaica, Virginia, wherever, does not reflect direct transport, but more the cleansing of the blackamoors from Ireland and Scotland. Now, when it comes to the latter part of these points, I will deal with that in another presentation. But these were the key points that I made in the prior presentation. Okay, because I will deal with this latter part when I deal with the Moors and how they came into the bloodline and how that shows up on DNA tests. Okay, so we can move to the next slide. So these are just two last additional points related to the Moors, even though that's not the focus of this particular lecture. But Isan Yoruba DNA was found in England. England was a melting pot filled with Iberian Moors, Sephardic Jews, Ashkenazi Jews who ran there during the Inquisition. There was also a sizable Romani Gypsy population there, along with Lascars who were South Asian and Southeast Asian. There was also a sizable established African population that arrived there during the Roman period. And of course, that's all contribution to the Moorish part of our DNA, which is the West African uh, ancestral composition that shows up on our DNA. So we can go to the next slide. Is there any way we can zoom in on that a little bit? Okay, so for people who download their raw data and they use the archaeogenetic group called My True Ancestry, this is what I'm showing, and I'm showing this because this is further evidence of the global nature of African DNA. This is the, if you pay a certain level in the My True Ancestry group, you're allowed to purchase a kit. You download the kit and you can map it out. So that's what I did. This is the Shum Laka Cameroon site. The skeletons from that site, they're primarily Khoisan. So that's what I'm showing by that slide. We can move to the next slide. So I mapped out that slide to look at all their matches all over the globe. And what I'm showing here is that when you map out the Khoisan sample, you can see all this ancient sites in Europe light up. Again, I'm just demonstrating the global nature of that DNA, because you have to train your mind in order to not get tricked by the DNA test. You have to train your mind not to think of African DNA as exclusive to the African continent. You have to think of it as ancient global DNA. Okay, move to the next slide, please. Again, these are just some more parts of the European map, and I'm just showing the extensive nature of that particular sample and how it pinches all of these ancient sites. The next slide, please. And of course, there's lighting up of the African map, which we expect. Okay, next slide. And then, of course, the southern part of Africa, there's pinging of all these sites. You can move to the next slide, please. Then you have the pinging of Asia. Again, the global nature of this DNA, all the ancient sites throughout Asia. You can move to the next slide. And then we have the pinging of the ancient sites that we have here in North America to Central America, even into Greenland, Alaska. You can move to the next slide, please. And then you have a pinging of the site down into South America. And it's not very clear, but you will even see there on the left side where it says Incan, there's even a site there that's 3000 BC that this Khoisan site is pinging. And I want your audience to take note of that, because we're going to end up returning to that area again. You can move to the next slide. Okay, so this is the ancestral composition, ancestry DNA results of my office manager. Her parents are from Honduras, And she's not an Afro-Honduran or a Garifuna. She's actually what we would call a mestiza. So as you can see, she has a significant amount of Spaniard DNA. They have indigenous Central 27, Spaniard 35%, a little bit of Scottish, North Italy, Basque, and then you have Senegal, which is a Moorish signal, but we'll deal with that another time. So again, you can see she's quite miscegenated. Move to the next slide. So I mapped out, I downloaded her DNA and I mapped it to America. Okay, so as expected, because she does have ancestry from Central America, Native American ancestry. As you can see, she's pinging ancient sites. So we're not surprised about this. The Asian people, the Asian population migrated here. The Proto-Mongoloids migrated here 10,000 years ago. So we should expect that someone like herself would pinch ancient sites. You can move to the next slide. We can look at the rest of the American map. And you can see here, she's pinging Central America, the Caribbean. And I want to focus in on that site where I have the arrow. She pinges the Inca site at 1500 AD, exactly right there. Keep that in mind. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is the archaeogenetic map. I did not post the ancestral composition of a Puerto Rican mestizo, but this is his archaeogenetic map. He also lights up the map. North America. Let's move to the next slide. And this is his South American map. And again, as you can see, he pinges some sites in South America. Again, the 1500 AD Inca site. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay, now this is someone from Guyana. She's a friend of mine. I could have picked someone else with a similar background. It could have been an African American or a Caribbean. The results will be the same, but I picked her. Okay, so you can see this is her ancestral composition. She actually is not recently mixed. She turns out to be 100% African, but again, just take note of her divisions: the Nigerian, the Ghana, the Senegambian, and the Bantu element, the four groups. That is a very Moorish pattern, but we'll analyze that another time. Move to the next slide. Okay, so as you can see, she's pinging the American sites as well. That means she shares genetic similarity with these ancient sites. Okay, let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is what I want to zoom in on, because in the site where I have the arrow, she is able to pinch the 3000 BC. And in fact, that's really not Incan, even though they have it labeled Incan. I believe the population that was there, the civilization, was called Moshi. But nevertheless, whatever is there at 3000 BC, she was able to pinch it. So very clearly, as you move back in time, the more ancient you move in time, the skeletons are closer to her ancestral composition as opposed to the mestizos. So that is what I am demonstrating. The only two people so far who was able to pinch that site was the Caribbean and the Khoisan. So I'm not taking away from anybody who is of Asian derivation, but all I'm demonstrating is that the primordial people had a certain type of ancestral composition, and it was that of the African. And that is what's showing up here. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is a anthropological article. And my main focus in presenting this is here they are talking about Negro skeletons that's found in the Virgin Islands. And in this article, they reference other articles that describe Negro skeletons found in Arawak sites in Barbados. Now, The purpose of showing this article, and I want to zoom in on the blue portion, or if you're able to, if not, let me just read it. It's okay. What it says here is, two views of the Barbados skull are shown. Comparison with the two skulls shown in the paper by Buxton, Trevor, and Julian indicates that the individual and sex differences are no more than would be expected of the range of variation in a single race. Certainly, however, such negroid features as alveolo-prognathism, broad nose, and low orbits are more pronounced in the case of the Virgin Island skull. So I'm pointing out their description of what makes a skeleton negro or negroid. They mention prognathism. Okay, that's one of the characteristics. And that leads me to the next slide. So this is an anthropological study that was performed by the Archaeology Society of North Carolina. And it happens that this study was done on the Waccamaw indigenous populations area, their tribal area. And so the archaeologists who examined the bones identified these bones as being Siouan and belonging to the Waccamaw Nation. So it's the findings that I would like to talk about. Next slide. We can move to the next slide. Okay, that's just some extra text. We can go to the next slide. So, okay, it's the highlighted that I would like to talk about. The face as a whole is of a gracile rather than rugged build and not large in relationship to the brain case. Take note of that. All facial dimensions tend to be moderate, and the same applies to the proportions. Prognathism is medium to submedium. The size of the mandible is medium. The most common chin form is bilateral, and gonial eversion is small to medium. Politzer indicates that the Iswanid variety is also characterized by a small, moderate, long, ovoid skull with small to medium brow ridges and medium frontal slope. This is a description of a Negro skeleton. Now, although prognathism is basically the protrusion of the mandible, and there are different degrees of it. It's an angle that's created when one measures from the forehead to the mandible. And in the Negro race, and also in the Mongol races, there's prognathism. But here's the difference. When they talked about the facial dimensions tend to be moderate and not large in relationship to the brain case. That's important because Mongol faces are large, they're wide. The other thing, they mentioned that the skull was ovoid. Mongol skulls are brachycephalic. They're not oval. They're not dolichocephalic. Okay, these are characteristics of Negro skeletons. So that's two characteristics that let you know that's a Negro skeleton. Okay, next slide. And by the way, that's the same area when Verrazano described the indigenous people as resembling Ethiopians. That was the same area that he was in. So that leads me over into the ancestral composition of someone who is a Waccamaw. And as a matter of fact, she's the mother of Chief Lavelle Pierce Moore of the Cape Fear Band of Scururi and Wokon Indians. So he gave me the pleasure of having access to his mother's DNA. So we can look at her ancestral composition along with other tribal members from different Eastern Woodland tribes and some so-called African American tribes, and you can see the differences and the similarity. So when you look at her ancestral composition, pay attention to the first line. You will notice that her Cameroon, Congo, and Western Bantu is 26%. Okay, so it's when you look at different samples, you will notice that that percentage is of a decent percentage, and that is a Bantu reference. And this can vary depending on the test. With 23andMe, it's called Angola, Congo, and Southeast African. In My Heritage, they call it Kenya. It's all a Bantu reference group and just represents genetic similarity to the Bantu population. All right. So, what we have to do is retrain our minds to not look for, how can I put it? We're not looking for our validity as indigenous descended people from having Native American DNA, because we were here before the Native Americans. The validity is coming from the Bantu DNA, the Pygmy DNA, the Sand DNA. So that's how we have to think. So the Cameroon, Congo, Western Bantu is the Bantu DNA. When we start dealing with the West African, you're dealing with Moorish DNA. So as you can see, she also has a little bit of the indigenous North American. Some of us will get that. And I've said this before, and I'll repeat it again. With Ancestry DNA, some people will show the results of having the Native American, which they're terming indigenous, and that depends on the percent that you have. It doesn't mean that it's not present if it's not given as a result. They reserve the right to report results at a certain threshold that they determine. And so a lot of people will not see these results unless they download these tests and upload them to third-party tests where everything is stripped naked, and then they can see the percentage. So I'm just pointing that out. Okay. And the other thing I wanted to point out, those of us in North America, because we are in a landmass where the Asian populations came into first, as opposed to people in the Caribbean, we are more inclined compared to many of the people in the Caribbean to having these markers. Some of them get it, but it's sort of hit and miss with them. Okay. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we move on, but we're more inclined to have it. It does not mean we are more indigenous. It's just the issue of geography. Just as someone from the African continent who's moving closer to North Africa is more inclined to have DNA from the Levant area and other areas where there are Eurasian mixtures, as opposed to Africans who are further away from the coastal areas or the northern areas or the Horn areas. It does not mean they are less African. So we cannot define ourselves by the people that came in. So that's the emphasis that I wanted to make. Next slide. That's just a continuation of her ancestral composition. And you can see here she gets the populations that's in Mexico. She has a little bit of a percentage there. And we tend to see that also on people who come from the areas that are from South Carolina going down. And that's just pure geography. Next slide. Are we able to zoom into that a little? Okay. Okay. So basically what I'm showing here is a Halawa Saponi, two Halawa Saponis. Right. I'm showing two Halawa Saponi results. And again, you notice they have a similar type of pattern. You will see the Nigerian, you see the Ghanaian. Now, of course, you see the England, which is based on the pale population that's there now. And also you see that Cameroon Congo. All right. Now, the person on the right is a Halawa Saponi member, a member who's a Halawa Saponi on both sides of their families. The person on the left, one of their parents is Halawa Saponi. And it's just a personal observation. I notice many people who come from endogamous societies, many of the tribes tend to result from cross cousin marriages. Over time, that elevated Bantu element tends to be a little bit more preserved. Not all the time, but I tend to notice it. You can go to the next slide. Okay. And you can minimize that a little for me. Thank you. Okay, so that's really the same. That's the same two individuals. They're related to each other, and I'm just showing their results side by side. And the Halawasaponi, full Halawasaponi, I should say, is on the right, and the person who's part of them but not full is on the left. So everyone really is miscegenated, whether they're in the tribe or outside the tribe, but you will tend to see that there are people who are in the tribe, I notice, tend to have a higher Bantu content. I also see people who have absolutely no tribal affiliations with quite a high number or a high percentage of a Bantu content, because some people just come from areas where the indigenous population just mixed among themselves, even under the identity of African American. It's not a one size fit all. Every family is different. Every area is also different. And you can move to the next slide. This is a Piscataway sample on the right. If we could zoom in a little bit. Okay. All right. Can you zoom in a little bit more? Okay. All right. That's good. So on the right side is a Piscataway member, and on the left side would be a cousin to the Piscataway member, a non-member. And what I want you to pay attention to is that Cameroon Congo. From the third down, note that relatively high percentage, 35%. And when you look at that individual's England, you can see that they intermingled, their forefathers intermingled a lot with pale Europeans from that area. And you can see not that much with the Moors. And that is why you notice the Senegal is less. You will see the Mali is less. So this is a person who belongs to the indigenous tribe, but they intermingled more with the current population who's there now. And I'm saying that for a reason, because Europe had a whole cleansing out period, and I'll deal with that another time. But as you can see on the left will be a so-called African American who's related to this Piscataway, and because of the nature of the history and enslavement of that person's ancestors, you have more mixing of the Moorish element, and that's what that represents. Okay, all right, you can go to the next slide. And you can minimize that for me. Thank you. Okay, this is a Wampanoag sample. All right. The person on the left is part Wampanoag. The person on the right is a Wampanoag member. And I want you to take note, there's a decent amount of Cameroon Congo. You also note that the indigenous percentage is quite high as well. So you can see this with some Northeast natives as well, especially if they keep intermarrying among themselves. And you will notice the person on the left, it is less. They have a slightly less Bantu element. It's not really that much difference, because I have seen it's sort of hit and miss. There are people in the tribes who have the same sort of patterns. And I have seen people, again, outside of the tribes who have a very indigenous pattern. My definition of indigenous being a high Bantu content. So it varies, and I'm just showing the variations. Bottom line, there's really not much difference between people who are in the tribes versus outside of the tribes in terms of the ancestral composition genetically. Next slide. And that's just a continuation of the same individuals, the Wampanoag on the right, the person who's only partially Wampanoag and Afro-American otherwise on the left. And if you also notice the one on the left, you see that Khoisan, she has 1%, the Southeast Asia, those are the Austronesian markers. Again, that may or may not show on Ancestry DNA, but the Austronesian markers are always reported on 23andMe, regardless of how tiny they are. When Ancestry DNA reports it, that means that it met a threshold that they felt was acceptable to report. That's all it means. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is an example of what I'm talking about. This is a Montserrat individual, and although Montserrat has a long history with the Black Irish, because the Blackamoors from Ireland, they cleaned them out and they sent them to the colonies, and especially to the Caribbean, and Montserrat in particular, again, every family is different. So this is an individual from Montserrat, and take note of her high Cameroon Congo. She has a very high Bantu element. Okay, so apparently in her family, she maintained ancestral composition that was quite indigenous. So again, when you're dealing with the Caribbean to North America, and really other parts of the Americas, but my focus is the mainland to the Caribbean, we're a composite of both indigenous and Moorish. And some families will show up as more indigenous genetically, and other families will show up more Moorish. I'm not talking about how one identifies, I'm strictly speaking about how the DNA is laid out. Okay, so take note of that in this particular individual. Next slide. All right, this is another individual from Montserrat, and as you can see, his Cameroon Congo goes down, and he has the higher proportions of the other elements. I'm just showing the variation, nothing else. You can move to the next slide. Okay. So I'm showing the Virgin Islands because people from the Virgin Islands almost invariably will get Native American on Ancestry DNA, because they have a decent amount that Ancestry considers to meet their threshold for reporting it. And that's an example of what I'm talking about when I talk about geography. Because if you look at where the Virgin Islands is located, it's adjacent to Puerto Rico. Now, in the Caribbean, you had colonies of Asian derived populations. You had the Yellow Caribs, you had the Black Caribs, you also had Asian derived Mongol Arawaks, and you also had the original Arawak population. Uh, just like here in North America, people are trained to think of indigenous people in the Caribbean as being of the Asian derived type, and to treat everyone else of the Negro phenotype as all newcomers. That is actually not true. That is not true. And I showed that by showing the article where there was Negro skeletons found in the Virgin Islands. These populations are not new. I'm not saying you didn't have newcomers like Moors and plus the transatlantic slave trade, but there was already a founding population that was there that predated the Asian derived population. So the significance here of showing the Virgin Islander is that just like us, we tend, those of us from North America, we tend to have tiny markers of North American native. If we do our JED matches, it pretty much shows on all of us if we use third-party tests and bear our DNA, so we can see varying percentages. But you won't necessarily see that from people from the Caribbean, because they're just barricaded, all right, by landmass. And that's just logic. If the Asian people came in from the north and from the Pacific, and they're in the Caribbean, it would they would have to cross more landmass before they get there. Plus, there were smaller colonies in the Caribbean, and the Caribbean was more dominated by the Black population, the original population, whereas we were dealing with a larger Asian derived population that came in on us. So it's just logical. Just like Northern Africans are more mixed, we would be more mixed with the Mongols, except you do have areas like the Virgin Islander. Okay, the Virgin Islanders are adjacent to an Asian mixed population like the people found in Puerto Rico. So it only stands to reason that they would be more inclined to have some percentages of the Mongol DNA. That's all I'm demonstrating. It's pure geography. Next slide. Now, consistent with what I'm talking about Bantu being the DNA we really need to focus on. It's ancient, it's global, it was here. And that is really what makes us indigenous, not having DNA of people that came in later. A good example would be the Garifuna people. The Garifuna people are pre-Columbian. Um, what is always advertised when you read about Garifuna people from texts of other people written about them, they will always make it sound like what makes them indigenous to America would be the Asian DNA they have. So this individual, and they're a very endogamous community. They were not enslaved. Uh, they came originally from the Vincent Island. They escaped. Many of them escaped into Honduras, Belize, Guatemala, Nicaragua, I believe. And if you look there, you can see many of them will have a decent size, what they call Native American population. But what I want the audience to pay attention to is not that. If they're from St. Vincent, that was also another colony of Asian derived um, of people, so there was mixing. So I'm not surprised about that. What I want the audience to pay attention to is that high percentage of Bantu DNA that they have. And of course, there was some mixing from pre-Columbian times in their own. They do have their own historians who talk about Malians coming there trading. We know Malians came. We know Abu Bakari the third came. So we were not strangers to West Africans. We were not strangers to North Africans. So they do have the influence in their DNA as well. But you can see they're predominantly Bantu. And if you notice, that is higher than any percentage that I actually showed so far. I think except for the Montserrat, that one Montserrat lady, and that was unusual for people from Montserrat. So we can go to the next slide. And proof that they did very little mixing with the Moors that were kicked out of Europe. You can see he only has 1.1% European DNA, which of course is based on the current population that's there. And that's important to remember, particularly when I come back and I deal with Moorish DNA, because that's a footprint as to where the Moors came from. But I won't deal with that in this slide. So that's proof they did very little mixing with the Moors from Europe. This is still why they preserve that large Bantu element. You can move to the next slide. This is just another Garifuna person, and I can pick them at random, whoever. This is just their pattern. As you can see, they show that decent amount of Cameroon Congo, which is from Ancestry DNA. Again, the large percentage of Bantu element. And on that note, I would like to point out, with regard to Nigerian or Benin Togo DNA, that some of it came from the Moors being cleared out of Europe, but some of it was here from pre-Columbian times. It is not all from Moorish intrusion. You had Yoruba colonies here in the Americas, particularly in the Mexico region in the Caribbean, going down. So please understand that Yoruba DNA, some of that was already here. Okay, because they had colonies and we were mixing with them. So it's not, it's important to understand the history and the genetics of the people here, so that when you get these results, you understand how to interpret it. You can't interpret this DNA without having a good foundation in the history of our people over here. All right, so this is not shocking that Garifuna people would show very little modern European admixture, which is a testament to their history and of how they were able to fight and escape away from enslavement, but they did not escape the Benin Togo, which is from that Yoruba type DNA. They did not escape that because that was what already here. There was intermixing that was happening in the Americas, in the Mexico, Central America, Caribbean area. That's that in South America as well. That's the part that I want to emphasize. You can move to the next slide. And again, I'm just showing more Garifuna samples. And again, the high Bantu content. We can move on. All right. Okay, so I'm showing all of this because I would like to show the contrast. These are Jamaican individuals that gave me access to their DNA. And this is a good example of what I'm talking about. There were two populations. While everybody mixed, some families are one type more than the other. Okay, so this is a Jamaican individual. And notice his Cameroon Congo. Notice how tiny it is. It's 0.9%. Okay, and if you look at his pattern, the Nigerian, the Ghanaian, the Senegambian, and then he has a little bit of that Bantu, that's a Moorish pattern. That's what I call the Amizag pattern. Let's look at the rest of his ancestral composition. And look at his large amount of European. Okay, so we can move to the next part. And this is something I will deal with when I come back. You will notice he gets the West Asian and North African. This is not a person who primarily got this DNA from West Africa. That's a North African. These were Moors. And this is an example of what I'm talking about. How is it that you're snatching people off of the west central coast of Africa, but this is a person getting North African and West Asian Persian elements? You only see this in the North African uh, type of ancestral composition, and these people were Moors. But I'll get into that another time and break that down for the audience. But I'm just showing, comparing, and I'm contrasting. This is a person out of Jamaica, born and bred, and this is how it is. And this is not uncommon. I see this all the time. Next slide. This is another person from Jamaica. Again, notice the tiny Bantu element compared to some of the other Caribbean people, the Afro-Americans, the tribal members, the Garifuna, 0.7. And if you notice, if you look there, you'll see Somali, 0.2. Again, what is a West African doing with Somali DNA? Well, the answer is very simple. If you look at people's DNA from North Africa, the Amizigh people, you will notice that they will tend to get this similar pattern. They will get a little bit of Northeast African, Sudanese, a little bit of Somalian. All it is a ancestral type of pattern that you find with the Amizigh North Africans who were also in Europe as well. So that's all it represents. Okay, that's the rest of his ancestral composition. And you can see he gets a little bit of tiny North African, which just represents the Martin mixture. So that's a mixture that happened in recent times, and that became a genetic group, and he caught a little bit of it. And we'll go into that a whole nother time, another day. Next slide. Okay. So for many people, when you download your raw data and you upload it to third-party DNA tests, among the most popular is GEDmatch. It's created by different geneticists. And here we get to match our DNA against different populations. Some oracles are more specialized for different populations. So I can tell you, just, looking at gazillions of samples, I look at the single population sharing, which is what this is from the MDLP, and I also look at the mixed mode population sharing. And I have to tell you, when I look at the single population sharing, which is what is on the screen here, everything that's listed there, it does not mean that the person descends from these populations or mixed with these populations. But what you can say is that within their genome is genetic similarity to these populations. So it very well may be those populations or populations that are genetic adjacent to these populations. But it's important because it goes along with the history. So if I'm saying that African DNA was most ancient and it's global, because it just simply is, and it was all over the place, what are the clues that prove that we are indigenous to a landmass? Well, you can work backwards, because if my DNA was in every landmass all over the planet, the way that I can prove that my ancestors were on this particular landmass is you work backwards and you work through the people that came in, i.e., the invaders. Because if the invaders came here, then I should share some of their DNA matching. Because inevitably, regardless of whether they came here on good terms or on bad terms, mixing occurs. Okay, so that's what I'm going to show. All right, so this is the MDLP single population sharing. Okay, and this is the Lumbee individual who allowed me to use his ancestry DNA raw data. And when you upload it to the MDLP, consistent with his results, the first matching population is Lumbee. And that would just make sense because evidently the Lumbee agreed to participate in genetic studies, and that became a genetic group that the GEDmatch geneticists are using. So as you can see here, the Lumbee is the first matching population because he's Lumbee. That's logical. But I want you to pay attention to the second group. The second group are two Bantu populations. Again, consistent with what I keep saying, that the primary population here was Bantu. So you have Lemba, a Bantu group, and then you have Bantu, which is obviously Bantu. And then you have Morocco, you have Puerto Rico, you have the Mozabite, which is the current population that they're using, the miscegenated individuals, although not everyone from Algeria, Mozabite is very miscegenated. Some of them are not so miscegenated, but that's based on that population. And you have Ethiopian. So people who have North African ancestry tend to have matches to Ethiopia. Okay. And they also have matches to the Yoruba. And plus, the Yoruba, as I've mentioned before, were here in pre-Columbian times. And then you have a little bit of Yemen. That tends to be some of the mixtures that the North Africans already have. Then you have the Tatar people. Let's pay attention to that, because the Tatars, we often talk about Native Americans being an Asian derived population. They were not the only Asians that came here. The Tatars also came here during Genghis Khan's reign. You had a lot of Asians that came over here, and they were Central Asian. So this is why we have matchings to the Tatar people. Okay, and sometimes some of it may show up as Chavash. You'll see that word Chavash, that's a group. You'll see Uzbek. These are all Tatar related groups. So they also came in. And then you have the Miwok people, who are indigenous people from the Southern California area. It does not mean we necessarily mixed with them, but it could be genetic similarity because they also possess Austronesian markers. So you have to kind of understand the components of different groups. It can very well mean ancestral mixing or similar type of genetic composition. And then Colville is a Native American population. They are Salish speaking people from the Pacific Northwest. So that just represents migration. Again, the Native American, different populations migrating and our people mixing with them. And then, of course, you have another group of Tatar. And then you have the Ashkenazi. That represents different mixtures that came into the bloodline. When you had the cleansing out of Europe, you had Sephardic Jews, you had the Ashkenazis, and then Egyptian, which again is part of the North African mix that some people will show up on their DNA, and Irish. No one needs to explain that. That speaks for itself. This is just all from modern mixing. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. So using the same MDLP, I'm using the Wakama lady, and we can see something very similar. Okay, you can see that again, her primary matching populations are Bantu, Lemba, Bantu. Then remember, we have the Yoruba. Again, these are people who see, and this is important for me to use people who belong to the tribes, because these people know their genealogy. Nobody cannot argue with them. They have the records, they know who they are. They know they're not from African slaves. They're not saying they don't have some ancient ancestral African mixing, but they know they're not from a slave trade. So it's very important for me to use their DNA and teach from it so we can have an understanding. So she has some Yoruba DNA as well. Okay. Then you have the Mandinka. Again, that's a Moorish signal. Mandinka is a Moorish signal. And then, of course, you have the Lumbi, because she's a Wakama, and I understand from her son, who's the chief, that the Wakama and the Tuscaroras were heavily intermixed back and forth. And so Lumbis are also a mixture of Algonquian, Siouan, and Iroquoian tribes. And the Tuscarora broke up and went into several directions, the Lumbi being among them. So it doesn't surprise me Lumbi is higher up on her list. And then, of course, you can see she has similar breakdown down to the Tartar, just like the Lumbi individual. Okay, she has the similar components. Puerto Rico, probably the Taino element. You can move to the next slide. Okay, this is a so-called African American. Again, nobody who belongs to a tribe. It could be anybody, and this is what I typically see: a similar type of composition to the two individuals before, the tribal members. Again, the Lemba, the Bantu, the Yoruba, the Mandinka, and this person also has matching to the Lumbi. It doesn't mean that they are a Lumbi member or a descendant of the Lumbi, but what it's picking up is the similar genetic ancestral composition to the Lumbi, which means a mixture of Algonquian, Siouan, Iroquois, because that's really what they are. Okay, and then of course you have the Ethiopian, Moroccan, all of this coming from the Moorish elements. You have the Jew Ethiopian, the Ethiopian again being a test group. Ethiopian, North Africans have a lot of Ethiopian elements, and then going down again, you see the Tatar, because again, the Tatar being a Central Asian group was one of several Asian people that migrated here, particularly under the reign of Genghis Khan. So we have some of their DNA. You can move to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going back here to my true ancestry, the archaeogenetic site. And this is why it's important that we study our own DNA and understand the genetic patterns, because this is an example of a mislabeling of an American Indian. And this is an individual who's called the colonial Delaware slave trade victim, slave trade. But let's look at their breakdown. Notice the similar pattern: the Lemba, the Bantu, Mandinka, Yoruba, Bantu, Biaka, Pygmy. Now, based on what I have taught, do we think that's a slave trade, an African slave trade victim? No, this is an individual who has the same ancestral breakdown from top to bottom as the individuals that I just finished showing in the slide. But look how they are labeling this person. And this is exactly what they did to our people. They mislabeled us. Again, I'm not discounting the African slave trade, but the primary people that were enslaved here were the indigenous people. The African slave trade came on top of that. And we know 350,000 or less actually came to North America. That does not explain 40 million of us. And that does not explain the ancestral composition that we have. So once you recognize the patterns, you won't get tricked into believing these lies. Slave trade victim. No, this is an indigenous individual that has been mislabeled and misclassified, just as many of our ancestors were misclassified and still are. Okay, next slide. Okay, right. So for many of you that participate with Ancestry DNA, you get something that looks like this called African American communities. And I really would like to break this down and explain this, because there's a trick that's being played on a lot of us, on all of us, really. And the key is to understand the trick. When it comes to so-called African Americans and Caribbean people, we are identified by our genetic components. And when it comes to other groups of people around the planet, they are identified by their ancestral communities. All right, or genetic communities, better. Okay, now let me explain. I said in the prior lecture when I was last here that Polynesians have on average 20 to 25% Bantu DNA, but the average person does not know this. And the reason the average person does not know this is because when they take a DNA test, the DNA test recognizes their genetic community through the pattern, the snaps, and it automatically recognizes it and allocates them to a genetic community called Samoan, Tahitian, Hawaiian. You understand? Because genetic communities are created by a group of people intermingling among themselves for a period of roughly 300 years at minimum within a certain radius. That creates a genetic community. So if you allocate an individual to the Samoan, the Tahitian, the Fijian, for example, genetic community, that means if you see 98% Samoan or whatever, you still don't see what's inside that genetic community. You don't see the components. You don't see how much Asian is inside of that person. You don't see how much African or pygmy DNA is inside of that person. But what happens is you just take that result for granted. Now, what they have done is allocate that genetic community as their identity, in which they are. They're Samoan. And then what they have done with us is that they have opened up your genetic community, and they are not allowing you to claim the genetic community as your identity. So let's pretend as if this genetic community, if you participate in Ancestry DNA, we all get this, right? So let's pretend these genetic communities were identities, and instead of saying African American, they used the word Indigenous American, and they did not reveal what was inside those genetic communities. So it would say, for example, Robeson County, North Carolina, Lumbee Indigenous American, early Southern United States Indigenous American, early North Carolina Indigenous American, and don't put the components. That's what they do for everyone else. But for you and me, they open up the category. So it confuses you, and you think, well, if this African DNA is here, then it means that we are not from here. But that's not the case. So they told on themselves by creating these communities, because it just happens that the individual who shared this with me also belongs to the Lumbee genetic community at the top. Let's read what's inside of that genetic community. Robeson County, North Carolina, Lumbee and African Americans connected to your regions of Cameroon, Congo, and Western Bantu, England, and Northwestern Europe, Scotland. They didn't even include Nigeria, Ghana, the Moorish DNA. They are telling you what these people are. Next slide. Now they're defining what that community is. Let's read it. Robeson County, North Carolina, where the Lumbee River flows, has long been the center for the Lumbee tribe. Archaeological evidence indicates a continuous indigenous presence there for at least 14,000 years. The Lumbee descend from this ancestral population, as well as from Eastern Siouan, Iroquoian, and Algonquian-speaking refugees and African Maroons who formed a growing community in the North Carolina swamps as more enslaved Africans were brought to North Carolina. Together, they were able to survive European colonization, warfare, and enslavement. So they're telling you what's inside of that community. Now, I have to tell you, when they say African Maroons, they are referring to the Moors that accompanied the conquistadors, Hernandez de Soto, when they first came into the Southeast. And you had some of them that fled and joined forces and went into the Great Dismal Swamp and joined the indigenous population. Okay? But again, that will not override the predominant DNA. So mixing occurred with Moors, Africans over time. It's nothing new. But the predominant DNA of that genetic group, again, was what? Cameroon, Congo. We can't get away from that. And that's them. They wrote this. I didn't write this. I'm just breaking it down, and I want people to pay attention. Okay? Next slide. If you can minimize it a little for me, please. So I'm using the timeline of a Mexican who's from the state of Oaxaca. Okay, that is the Pacific coast of Mexico. I'm using their timeline, okay, to demonstrate something. All right. And I'm going to prove that the ancestry timeline of this Mexican tells the truth and tells the history. Now, if you look at the very bottom of that timeline, that will be the founding populations for each and every one of us. When we do 23andMe and they do this, you can see, you see the, I know it's difficult to read, so let me read it. Austronesian, Thai, Khmer, and Myanmar. That's the Southeast Asian. We spoke about that, right? The very bottom, the yellow. We spoke about how they were the earliest seafarers that came here into the Americas. And if you look right on top, who did those Austronesians mix with? The Angola Congolese. That's the Bantu DNA. And right next to that is the African hunter-gatherer. That just means pygmy. All right. So you can see the founder portion of this Mexican's DNA is the Bantu, pygmy, and the Austronesian, the earliest people that came, that were mixing here. The Bantus and the pygmy people, Bantu type DNA, I should say, and pygmy people were here. The Austronesians came and mixed. Let's move up. Then you have Southeast African Senegambian. So Senegambian is the predominant ancestral composition of North Africans, Moors. When you see DNA that says North African, people match places like Morocco and those type of places. Again, those are genetic communities. Okay, but people are tricked into thinking those are like races. That's not a race. But if you would take the North African and the modern North African, the miscegenated North African, and you break down their components, a great part of it, particularly those from Northwest Africa, they're Senegambian predominant. They're no different genetically. I didn't say they're not different culturally, but they're no different genetically from Senegambians. So there was mixing going on back and forth. Okay, so let's go up the timeline, and you can see that the last portion of what mixed into the Mexicans' DNA is what? You have to expand it now. And then slide it over the other side, please. What do you see there? Native American. So how can the people with Native American DNA be the most ancient to this land? Again, I'm not saying they are not rightfully so here from ancient times. I'm not taking that away from them, but they are not the most ancient to the land. When you look at some people from Mexico, not all Mexicans have this, by the way, but some of the Mexicans will show this pattern in their ancestral composition. The earlier part of their DNA is not the Native American. It is actually the Bantu. It is actually the Austronesian. So the Native American cannot be the most ancient. Ancient, but not most ancient. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is a so-called African American. Again, for those of you who participate in 23andMe, again, notice the similarity to our timeline. This reflects what happens. All right, look at the earlier part of the DNA. What do you see? Something very similar to what we saw with the Mexican from Oaxaca. You see again the Indonesian, the Khmer, Myanmar, Southeast Asian, the Filipino, all Austronesian markers. What do you see next to it? The Southeast African. That's again a Bantu marker. It could be Angola, Congo. It could be Southeast African. It's all Bantu similarity. All right. Then what comes in later? The Indigenous American. Those are the people they're calling Native American. Again, not denying their ancient presence, but no, they are not the most ancient. I didn't say that. The timeline said it. DNA says it. And then the rest of it is all Moorish DNA. And we'll deal with that when I come back another time. Okay? Let's move on. Okay, so, some of you've heard of Kennewick Man. Basically, he's an ancient skeleton that's roughly 8,000 years old. And the people that we're calling Native American match him. Throughout the Americas, they match him. So we're not surprised about that. Again, I don't deny their ancient presence here, and Kennewick Man is an example of it. But again, let's look at Kennewick Man's ancestral composition. Okay, I'm just proving something here. So we know Kennewick Man is primarily related to the people that we are calling Native American and American Indian. And when you look at Kennewick's Man, this is the year of Genes 13, and you look at his ancestral composition, you can see he has, on the very bottom, I have it highlighted, 4.5%, roughly 4.5%, what they call sub-Saharan African DNA. The only reason, again, I'm showing this is to show, again, the global nature of the DNA. I just periodically go back to it because I want people to absorb that. That's all. So even Kennewick Man was not the original, but Kennewick Man still did not escape some of our DNA. That is the only point I'm making by showing this. You can go to the next slide. Okay, this is a picture of Salish Native Americans. So the reason why I'm showing this, because for some of your listening audience who play with the GEDmatch, you may notice that on some of the calculators, like MDLP, the regular MDLP, even the MDLP 22. Not all of us, but quite a few of us will get Colville, Colville, and I showed it in the Lumbee sample earlier. This is the people that they're referring to. So to me, what they symbolize again is the mixing of the people that came in with our people. We mixed with the people coming in. So, as I said before, since ancient DNA was global, the way you prove your ancientness to a particular landmass is you go back and you should see evidence of mixing with these people that came in as well. Okay, so we can move to the next slide. And I also talked about the Tartar people. This is an example of Tartar people, a Central Asian people. And I showed that in the breakdown when you looked at the MDLP and you looked at the different components, you could see that we had Tartar in our single population matching for many of us, okay, because they were among several people that migrated here. There were different Asian migrations. We can go to the next slide. And these are the Tatars in Lithuania. So I'm just showing what these people look like when you see these individuals showing in your secondary populations or in your top 20 matches on GEDmatch. Understand these are the individuals. Right now, they're also miscegenated, but they preserved a great deal of their Asiatic features. Okay. It's not also uncommon when you look at some of the secondary populations to see Alaska or Eskimos. And Eskimo is really a conglomeration of different people, could be Inuit and different ethnicities altogether. They put under the category of Eskimo, and you can see these trace markers in many of our people's DNA as well when we upload it to third-party test GEDmatch, and I encourage people to do that. Please just don't rely on mainstream tests because they won't report small results, and it does not mean it's not there, because the question becomes, why are they there, period? Okay, so there's a definite pattern. All right, so the next slide, please. Okay, I'm mentioning this for a reason, because again, this is important to is important to understand history, the people we traded with, the people we warred with, the people that migrated here, whether they were friends or foes. All of these people came into our DNA, and I'm showing this because we traded with the Basque people of Europe. There was a lot of trade going on between us and the Basque people, and the founder of Native DNA, which is a DNA company, Chris Lusakis, he mentioned that for many Afro-American and tribal members, just about all of us get tiny matches to the Basque people. So there was a lot of trade going on with the Basque people. Um, they are ancient people of Europe. So sometimes when we have matches to Southern Europe, again, one must do their genealogy. We just don't do DNA tests. Each family individual must do their genealogy. Sometimes that's what they're picking up. It can very well be Basque. So there was even a trade language between the Basque and the Algonquians. That's how much trade was going on. So we can go to the next slide. So I'm going back now that I talked about different migrations that came here. Now I'm showing how it shows up. So if you look here, this is an African American sample. And we talked about the Bantu being primordial, the Yoruba again being here from pre-Columbian times, or very well could have been part of the African complex coming in from the Moorish influence. The similarity to the Lumbee simply from being Algonquian, Iroquoian, Siouan mixes. Of course, the Moroccan being part of the Amazigh influence going down. I want to focus on the highlighted, okay? I mentioned the Tartar. So now when you guys do the GEDmatch and you see this, and I talked about the Colville, the Salish speaking people, okay, from Pacific Northwest portion of the United States, the state of Washington. Again, now you understand why you're getting this, okay? Next slide. And I'm just again showing the similar mixtures, the Wakama sample. Again, primordial matching is the primary matching part of me is to the Bantu population, and then going down. Again, I'm just showing, you can see the Tatar on her. All right. That's one of the people that came here and they mixed in with our population. All right. We can go to the next slide. This is the Lumbee sample. And you can see again what I demonstrated before. Again, you're looking at the Tartar Crim and the Colville you see there at number 14. Again, the mixing. That's all I'm showing. Next slide. This is the individual. She's part Afro-American and Wampanoag. And again, you see similar mixtures. You have the Colville at the bottom, and you can see the Tartar at number 19. Again, just showing the mixing. I'm showing the similarity between people in the tribes, outside the tribes, who are just half of the tribes. All right. Okay, you can go to the next slide. All right. So I talked about how the Basque mixed and traded a lot back and forth with our ancestors, and it can show up in the Eurogenes 36. It's not the best calculator, but what I have found is that regardless of how small, that bass always shows up. So you can look here, you can see I have it highlighted. You can see Basque is highlighted with the Wakama sample. You can go to the next slide. The Lumbee, you can see the Basque. There's tiny Basque influence. You can go to the next slide. This is the Jamaicans, and you can see, again, the Basque influence. Next slide. And I deliberately picked this individual. This is a Montserrat individual who had no signals at all, okay? Hardly any Bantu markings, no Native American markings, nothing, okay? And had strong Irish component. And as you can see, no Basque. So that is very consistent with indigenous lineage. Even the Native Americans, the Asian derived Native Americans, they tend to have Basque as well. Go to the next slide. I'm closing up. Okay, this is an archaeogenetic map, and this is of a Jamaican who has actually, now archaeogenetics basically matches our DNA to ancient skeletons all over the planet. And this is something that I've noticed consistently with a lot of my Caribbean um, individuals when I look at their archaeogenetics. If you notice what they have highlighted, if you look at the circles that are lit, that represents genetic similarity. So the bigger the circle, the closer the genetic similarity. So, you know, it's hard to see the map of Africa, but if you look at those two big circles, that's Ethiopia and that's Kenya. Okay. So it doesn't surprise me that there's close matching to the Mota sample of Ethiopia. But what I want the audience to pay attention to, if you look at the site that's on the left portion, what's lit up is the skeletons of the Patagonian sites, and they're really primarily Asian derived. Okay, that's the skeletons that they're using, but let's work with it, okay, because there was intermixing. What I notice with Caribbean people, okay, regardless of what their ancestral compositions show, they have close matching to this Patagonian sites in South America. Like once you remove their ancient matching to the Pygmies, Khoisan, and you start looking at different ancient sites, right behind that will be the Patagonian site. So even though they're not necessarily presenting the most ancient skeletons, nevertheless, to show you how many of their ancestors were here from ancient times, there was so much mixing going on that they have close genetic ties to those sites. So this is a picture that you could only appreciate if you had something to compare it to. So as you can see here, the Patagonian sites in South America are lit up. They're decently lit up. It's not lit up to the point of the site in Ethiopia because they're Asian derived, but nevertheless, they're lit up. Okay, and you have sites, of course, in Europe lit up as well. Let's go to the next slide because I'm going to compare it. Now, this is a person who's North American, all right? And you barely notice, you see just a little bit of that the Patagonian sites lit up. You see, of course, the Ethiopian Kenya sites lit up a lot, as it should be in terms of genetic similarity. We're talking about ancient Bantu sites. But what I want you to pay attention is that North African Canary Island. If you notice, those sites are lit in this individual, and it was not really lit in the Caribbean person. Now, what I notice with many people from North America, there's an opposite. While they do have some matching to the Patagonian sites, the closest matches outside of the Pygmy, Khoisan, Bantu, the next closest match are the ancient Ibermurusian sites. And that is what I wanted to point out because that will tie into my next presentation when I come back, when I deal with the Moors, because we mixed with them from ancient times and we mixed with them in modern times. And that influenced everyone's DNA, whether you're a tribal member or you're not a tribal member, whether you're a so called African American, Caribbean, or however you choose to identify. And that will conclude my lecture.
Yes. That was brilliant. That was very
Yeah.
brilliant. I think you killed that
Good.
because the comparing of like the like with the Jed match with the 23andMe, you showed the sequencing and stuff. I don't think people like the young lady right here, Vanessa Gang said, no, not right there. She said, "This is deep,"
Mhm.
and it is.
I want to dive into these questions as people had a lot of good questions here.
Hmm.
So we're gonna go ahead and get started and dive into those.
Before you do that,
James Jones said,
I
"Go
want to
ahead."
thank everybody for coming out. We had about like 600 people in here. Now it's 404. I
Mhm.
thank everybody for showing up because I mean this is Saturday. Y'all could be anywhere else in the world, but y'all here with us, and it's we really appreciate that. I'm sorry to cut you. Go ahead.
Absolutely, absolutely, it's okay. So James Jones asked, "Do you think 12% is one or two generations?"
You can't look at percentages and determine how many generations it goes back. We're talking about autosomal DNA, so you can't determine that. That I would tell you that it when no, you can't determine that. No. Mm-mm.
Yeah. All right, so we have Jacob Burns asks, "How can I get her to read my DNA? I think I was lied to." Are the people able to come to you for DNA analysis?
I'll be honest, I'm way too busy for that. But if you go back and you re-listen to what I pointed out and play with the DNA, because a lot of this is just
Mhm.
really playing with it. Nobody taught this to me. Um, People who understand everything that I'm saying with these are people who participate in uploading their DNA, looking at results, paying attention to patterns. And what happens with GEDmatch is that you could click on your kit number and then get all the kit numbers that are related to you. And what you do is you look at
Hmm.
them as well. You literally have access to hundreds of samples. So you should take advantage of that and learn. I mean, I'm open to questions, but to open myself up to analyzing people's DNA, that's extremely tedious. But
Hmm.
I would encourage you to participate in genetic groups. You learn that way, and go back and really re-listen because I gave away a lot of pearls,
Hmm.
and it
Absolutely.
and it will help. And especially especially after I come back. When I come back, you will know how to interpret your DNA. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. All right, so we have Stephen Harris says, Fatu, would you say we are more Moorish or Indian?
It depends on the individual and it depends on the family. Um, there are people who have a very indigenous pattern. They have high Bantu content. And there are individuals who come from a cluster where you can see that, because see, I'm talking about genetics. I would imagine you're talking about genetics, not identity. So just speaking about what I see genetically. And then there are people, like I gave the two Jamaicans, they had a very Moorish pattern. But yet, because I know one of them personally, I grew up with one of them actually. And if you would see his mother, I mean, she actually looks oceanic. But what happens when you're dealing with the Caribbean? We have to also understand there was a lot of pre-Columbian mixing with West Africans as well. We have to talk about that because these this kind of pre-Columbian mixing also influences the results. So I said I would dive into that when I come back because if you just look
Mhm.
at the currents, you will see that it's nothing for West Africans. I believe in some people's oral history. I actually read from a maroon was saying one of his elders talked about how you had people from the area we call Nigeria coming in boats and trading with them. So with trade comes mixing. So there was mixing
Mhm.
going on. And like I said before, you had Yoruba type DNA in Mexico, Central America, South America. They had colonies there. They are not the founding population, but they came here. Okay. And there was mixing, but to say we are more is absolutely not, because I showed samples
Mhm.
where you can see these people were primarily indigenous. The top populations
Mhm.
that they were matching were Bantu type of DNA, and that's not transported DNA, that's ancient DNA. And then I showed the example with the Jamaicans and one of the Montserrat sample, where I would say that they are primarily Moorish. That's just how it is. And I understand there are certain areas of Jamaica, where people will be more inclined to be of one type versus the other. And it's the same thing with us. I would imagine that there was more mixing with black Moors who were enslaved. I mean, if you're talking about the United States, especially if you're coming from the city areas, if your parents come from more city areas as opposed to, inside the countrysides, I'm just kind of using common sense. You understand? So that depends on family to family. It's not a one size fit all.
Got you. All right, Vanessa Gaines asks, how do we get the land back? And I think that's utilizing the DNA, if I'm not mistaken with your question.
Oh, I don't know.
Unity.
Hmm. Yep. All right, Christina King. She asks, how did you find out all of this information?
Hmm. That's a good
Study.
question. Sometimes I don't even know how I'm led to this information. I do believe it's spiritual
Yes,
because
I agree.
I definitely believe it's spiritual. Somehow or another, I'm I don't want to make this sound like I'm a one man show. I talk to a lot of people, me, Miko, we bounce things for a while. We bounce things off of each other. Sometimes some people can say things to me and it'll pinch something inside of me, and then I'll look and I'll find stuff that I never saw before, nobody else saw before. My eyes will catch something. I would just say so far it's a gift.
Mhm.
Definitely.
Yeah, I'm not a
Definitely.
genetic. I'm not a geneticist. However, I'm good at picking up patterns, and it's the patterns that I'm able to pick out.
Beautiful. All right, Sosa Bread TV. I mean, sorry, Sosa Bread TV. Excuse me. What does she think about the Gullah Geechee DNA? Are they indigenous?
Yes, they are indigenous,
Mhm.
but just like pretty much all of us, really all of us, they have the Moorish element as well.
Okay, and I love this next question. Jaden Ward says, "How does this come into play with genealogy?"
Well, it should make you very confident that indeed that for the average one of us, we're coming off of indigenous lines. Okay, so if you approach that, when you approach this with confidence, you'll have a better understanding, because if I didn't understand this, then I'm still looking for the African on my mother's side. Now I am
Mhm.
half African. For those of you who don't know, my father was from Ghana. My mother's was from North Carolina, Northeast North Carolina. So until I found out, now when I was 19, I'm 53. So when I was 19 years old, I started doing a lot of research. I was very curious about my mother's side because I knew everything about my father's side. And it was when a distant cousin said something to me, that's when my genealogical research went into another direction. That distant cousin said to me, be mindful that some of our surnames are not coming from slave owners, but in fact, they belong to the tribes. And that's how I
Mhm.
was able to break through brick walls. Okay. And then my knowledge started growing and growing. Then I started reading about what took place, because I noticed that my mother's family's phenotype was completely different from my father. And I'm not talking about just simply skin color, because there are different, various skin colors in the African continent. I was just looking at their facial features, their body builds, and I could see that they were just two different populations. And not to mention just the behavior, just the oral history. My great grandmother was a midwife and she was also a healer, and just the way they moved. They just moved very differently. So I was always very curious to know what I wasn't being told. And
Mhm.
it's just one step after the next. So to me, it should come into play and play. How does this fit also into genealogy? Well, this is DNA. So if you build a tree and you use a platform like Ancestry DNA, whatever you can't find, if you can't go but so back, if you build a tree and you work with whatever you do know, they do the rest for you, and then they start matching people who share your trees with you. The other thing too,
Mhm.
what also helps, is to understand the surnames that many of the tribes around us have. And the reason why that helps is because you can do something called triangulation, and you can see
Mm,
how related you are to them. No, it doesn't mean you're a tribal member, but if you start seeing that every time you click onto a tribal member, the other same surnames keep popping up as shared relatives, and then you click on the other relative, and then the other same individuals with the same surnames keep popping up, well, that's a sign that that bloodline is highly mixed among themselves, and you're looking at least some part lineage from that particular group.
Okay. So Jaden also had another question. Do you think they know this? And I'm not sure who he's referencing as they.
Who's they?
Um,
that's a good
that's my
question.
question to Jaden.
Hey.
Who is they? And if you're still here, you can go ahead and give us that answer and we'll get back to your question. Um, Cesar Lopez says, I have 10% black blood. Where do I fit in?
Well, what kind of black blood do you have, sir? Is it
I think
Senegambian? Is it
that
Cameroon Congo? Is it Cameroon Congo? Because if it's Cameroon Congo, you're in luck. Is it
what I'm
Angola
gonna say to
Congo?
Caesar, what I'm gonna say to Caesar is go back and listen to the video again, because in the beginning of this video, when she starts her presentation, she goes into where those different groups fit in. And if you look at your DNA, you see these groups, you can kind of go in and pinpoint where you fit in there, and you can answer your own question actually. Um, All right. So, Sosa Bread TV says, do abo blood types play a part in indigenousality? I'm sorry, I can't say that word right.
Indigenuity. Um,
Nuity. Thank you.
I don't think so because we're only talking about we're talking about three blood types. We know O is the most ancient of them all, but you find O
Right.
everywhere. I mean,
Hmm.
you find O in Europe. I know Europeans with type O, and so that's not enough. I mean, to prove it. I mean, my father was African. He had type O. I mean, we did mix with different people, so that might be expressed with a different blood type. It does not make you any less indigenous than anything else.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Alexis Lopez asks, what's the original blood?
She
Oh,
just said
She
it.
just said,
She
yeah,
just said
it's
it.
O.
oh, hmm
um, we have Ayana says, how do you feel about natives saying you stole their identity?
yeah. I feel that they're operating out of ignorance and racism because the DNA supports what I'm saying. That's why I never argue with them.
Mm.
When
Mhm.
they tell, people who say that, who keep throwing the DNA, and this is why this was very important to me because one of the things that I started seeing, I'm talking about our people, that was disturbing to me. We was internalizing that and identifying and validating ourselves from their DNA, and I'm saying I'm gonna switch that because the validation of the ancientness is from my DNA, not theirs. I can prove that I
Mhm.
was on this planet m- longer than anybody else. So when they say that, I don't take them seriously because when
I'm
they
not going.
say to any of
Mhm.
us, "Let's see your DNA," they're playing in my yard.
I like that. I like
Yeah,
Yeah,
that.
let's see the DNA. I want to see the DNA.
absolutely. All right. Conrad asks, are you Whitmore Science Temple of America?
No, I'm not a Moor.
Honestly, I don't think that anybody's preference in that way. I probably shouldn't even put this up here to ask that question. I don't think that that's something that we need to put out there and discuss. That's her personal preference or business if that is what she chooses to do or not.
Mhm. But no, I'm not a
Um,
Moor. I'm not a Moor. I just analyze DNA. I'm a truth seeker, and I call it like I see it. I don't have an emotional reaction to DNA results, which is what I see all around me. And if you're really a true researcher, you detach yourself from the results and you accept you accept the results. And what you try to do is understand the history. I'm not telling anybody how to identify.
mm,
Identification is one that is individual. It's influenced by how you're socialized, and it's influenced by your particular upbringing. So I'm not
Exactly.
right.
pushing a particular identity. If you notice, I'm not even telling anybody to identify as indigenous because there are some of our people that are heavily identified with the African continent, no matter what I say. And maybe some of it is ancestral because perhaps that's the Moorish part of them that is speaking to them. I don't know. And then there are people, they always knew they were indigenous. Now, despite the fact that my dad is African, I always knew my mother was indigenous. I just always understood that. And I set out to prove it.
All right. We have Vanessa. She asks, can we find Moorish elements in our tree? And you're talking on as far as genealogy. Yes.
Hmm. Most definitely. It's so funny you asked that because I just found somebody's Moorish ancestry.
Okay. All right. So Nanima says, why do some of our own people still hold on to African descent, even if you show them the difference?
Well, I think people who hold on to African descent, I think that's a multi-layered answer. I will tell you, the people that I find the hardest to convince are people who come from broken families and who really don't have history of communicating with their grandparents or aunts and uncles, and this is part of the devastation of our family units being broken down, because I learned about my family from my elders on both sides. I learned about my father's side from my dad and from my older cousins and from my uncles. Okay. And when it comes to my mother's side, I learned a lot of this from her aunts, my great uncles, and my older aunts and uncles. Unfortunately, I lost my grandparents at a young age. But if you basically don't know your dad and you don't know your granddad, and you're dealing with a whole lot of broken, what I call branches on your family, and all you're holding on to is a phenotype and a historical doctrine that deliberately takes you off of this land. You have to understand, and African this, Pan Africanism, and then of course we do share some phenotype with the people of the African continent. I can see how when you just add all of that up together, it is hard to remove that from some people's brain. So it
Mhm.
depends on what you're working with.
Okay. We have a question from Keisha. My father's black, mother's white. Micco found my ancestry. I was told I'm not indigenous because of my mother.
Nobody has the
Was
right.
this? Well, I was wondering if it was genealogy or a DNA analysis.
I
I'm
found
guessing genealogy.
her ancestry. Like I did her tree. Like, oh man, I'm getting old.
Mm.
That was like a year ago, and I think she went back to either Choctaw or I think it was Cherokee. I think it was. Like I'm saying, this.
We just we posted some of her results, right? I believe it
Mhm.
was Choctaw. I believe it was Choctaw.
I believe so. But as far as somebody telling, well, I'm gonna let the doctor answer.
Well, nobody can tell you your blood speaks. Nobody can tell you who sits on the committee to tell you whether you're indigenous or not.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's the same thing that people of the Asian derived community that we're calling Native Americans, they're telling us we're not indigenous to the land. I mean, who can tell me who my forefathers are and what makes me indigenous? I don't let anybody tell me that.
Right, right.
I
And
mean,
I'm gonna correct that. She wasn't Choctaw. She was Cherokee
Ah,
and
right.
India. Hmm.
Okay.
All right. Andrew asks, "Do African Americans have Olmec DNA?"
Good question.
it depends, and it depends on what part, where their ancestors come from. You will find that some of us have, like, let's say for instance, myself, I had a decent amount of matching. I did the native DNA test. Miko, we're familiar with the native DNA testing company by Chris Lusakis, and his results very much match up with I'm very sure you guys genealogical research. And I had a decent amount of matching to the Yucatan, the people that are in the Yucatan. So some of us do, particularly people that have more Muskegean tribal mix. As you start moving south, yes, some of us do have it. It's not a fixed and hard rule, but some of us have it, particularly people who descend from the Creeks.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yep.
and it depends. It
Mhm.
depends. It's not a one size fit all. If you are like some of my lineage comes from the Piscataway Nation, and if you're from that region, you will notice they get Southeast Asian markers because I've seen their DNA test results, but it's not as much. The percentage is not as much as the Muskegean mixed tribes further south. So things start changing as you start moving up. But you can't you can't just say, that because we are African American, which is a false misnomer in itself, but let's go with it for
Mhm.
now. You can't say that we automatically have Olmec DNA. Some of us did migrate, have put it this way, some of us descend from tribes that some portion of that tribe migrated, and I'm careful in how I'm saying that, because we were anciently here in North America, and some of our lineage migrated out of the Mesoamerican area. This is why some of us will get this tiny percentage to to the current population, and it shows up as Mexican, 1% Mexican, and you will see some people with tiny matches to current South America based on the population that's there now. Absolutely. But it's not a one size fit all. It depends on that particular African American and what tribes they descend from, because you had the Muskegean tribes that had a lot of the Mesoamerican tribal mixture. So some of them, if they especially descend from the Creeks or the Florida tribes, they will tend to have Olmec mix. Absolutely, but it's not a fixed rule.
All right. So Subred TV asks again, judging by DNA, which people, um, I don't know why I'm fumbling with words today. Continentally, would you give the greatest antiquity? What is wrong? I'm fumbling today. Antiquity today. The antiquity too. I'm sorry.
Well, if they're able to pick up pygmy, or what would show up as South African Bantu, those would be the most ancient. But let's say if that's not present, and you're not always going to pinch that on conventional DNA tests unless you start looking into third-party DNA tests. But whatever is the Bantu, so I'm answering, let's say you get your results from Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, MyHeritage, whatever is the Bantu, that will be the more ancient portion of your ancestral composition. Okay.
Okay. All right. So we have three more questions here. Need to be the last three that we'll take. Um, Brandon Jones says, Miko found my ancestry. I'm African and Jamaican.
Oh
What
yeah.
would the sequence
Hold
look
on.
like?
And you're also Jamaican. Well, I'm going to answer you based on the memory of how my sequence, how that looks. And my sequence looked just like any so-called African American, except at the very top was Ghanaian. Okay, so what part of Africa is your ancestor? I mean, is your other parent from?
I think I found for him. I think it was Nigeria.
Okay, but is
Yeah.
that when he says he's African and Jamaican, is that how he's identifying, or is it because one of his parents is from the African continent? That I'm not sure.
I remember him. I think his dad was from Nigeria, and
Okay.
then like the Jamaican part we found on his mom's side.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I remember him. Yeah.
He's saying what
Mhm.
the sequence would look like, and that can vary because again, I have seen Jamaicans with a moderate Bantu component. All right, so they were more of an indigenous pattern. And then again, I just showed you Jamaicans that had more of a Moorish pattern. Their Bantu component was not even 1%. And they were even matching Western Asians and North Africans a little bit. So I can't answer that unless I actually look at the results, because when you start talking about Jamaica, you had a decent sized amount of Moors that went into these to that
Mhm.
island and to some of these islands. It didn't take much to fill the islands up with Moors. We're just talking about small areas. So some
Mhm.
people are quite Moorish.
All right. We have Darius Jackson. He asks, how does your African side feel about you claiming indigenous?
They don't care.
John Reed, are the Moorish Europeans the Santas, the Muslims that conquer Spain?
The Santas?
I don't get what he mean.
Are he perhaps he's asking, are the Moorish Europeans the same as the Muslims?
I
I
think
don't.
that might be
That
what
makes
he said.
sense because
Are
the
they
Saints is
I
dumb.
think so. I don't know.
are they the same as, well, when we start talking about Moors, there were different types of Moors. Okay, so if we're talking about the Iberian Moors, they came into our bloodlines as well. Okay, and that's a whole nother conversation. Okay, sometime
Mhm.
when we talked about when I talked about when I showed the genetic community for the Lumbee, and they described it right there, and they said that genetic community was created by a combination of the Iroquois and Algonquian and all of those people and the African Maroons. They were talking about Moors because the African Maroons that they are talking about were the people that accompanied the conquistadors, Hernandez de Soto, who came into the Southeast, who joined in with the indigenous tribes. Some of them left and joined in and mixed. And you will find that the Spaniards, wherever they went, they had their Moors with them. And this is exactly why I'm giving a little segue to the next time. This is exactly why, when you look at Latin American people's results, they all basically, the African DNA that they tend to have tends to be, without a shadow of a doubt, Senegambian, even though they may have a little bit of Nigerian, 1% Nigerian, but they will all practically have Senegambian. And the reason why is the European armies were not large enough to execute what they were executing against the amount of people without help. So they used and they worked with the population that was among them. You could call them Africans, you could call them Moors. So who was in the Iberian Peninsula? It was North Africans, people from who originated from the North African continent, and people who originated from the Northwest African continent. And then it will require you to understand what kind of ancestral composition those people had. So wherever the conquistadors went, their Moors went and helped them. They could not have achieved that level of domination from Mexico to the Caribbean to the tip of South America with just pale Spaniards. They needed help. So this is
Mhm.
why wherever you see Spaniard DNA, you see Senegambian DNA.
Mm.
That is not directly from Senegal. That's Moorish signal. And wherever the British went, they used their Moors as well. While they enslaved some, they also used some. Some of the men in the Revolutionary Army on the side of the British were black men that were still in England. What kind of DNA did they have? So I'm going to touch upon all of that. So that is why I said the Pale European DNA, which represents the DNA that's currently in Europe, which is their test population, is a time stamp, which is a stamp and a marker of the Moorish DNA.
Mhm.
And that's the only reason you see that sort of pattern. This is why there's a Nigerian Ghanaian predominance with the people that descend from the British occupied places. And the reason why, if you pay attention to the so-called African American and tribal members, the reason why we tend to have more of a Senegambian mix lies in the fact that the indentured servants that came into the colonies initially before there was chattel slavery, they came out of England, and that's kept hidden. But they came out of England, and if you trace their path, those Portuguese Moors that we're talking about, the Anthony Johnsons, who was originally Antonio Johnson, we're talking about Manuel Driggers, who was originally Manuel Rodriguez, okay, and Paul Hynek documented them. We're talking about the Chavises, who was originally the Chavis, who was originally Chavez, Perry's, who was originally the Pereiras. These were Portuguese Moors that came out of England, and originally they arrived there during the Inquisition when they ran out of the Iberian Peninsula. This is why in 1601, what did Queen Elizabeth say? She wanted those neggers and blackamoors out of her province. They came out of
Yeah.
the Iberian Peninsula. But if you trace them in the Iberian Peninsula, where did they come from? They came primarily from North Africa and heavily
Yeah.
from the Sanhanja people who are in Algeria. So there's a
Mhm.
reason that we match these people, and I will show it next time I'm here, that we still match those people because it's all indirect. You have to understand the history.
Absolutely.
So you had Northwest Moors from the areas of England, and you also had Moors that were seated there before the Iberian Moors. So you had Yoruba type DNA already present in England. So you had blacks who were already seated from the period of the Roman Empire who was living in the area of England, Scotland, and Ireland. And they were of more of the Nigerian type of DNA. And that influences what you're looking at in the Caribbean. But again, when I come back, I'll deal with that.
Absolutely. This is a very powerful show to me, man. I learned so much myself, and I talk to
Yeah.
Fatou daily. I learned so much about the sequencing and putting things together. And what I learned was that a lot of the stuff that I'm reading, she validated everything that I studied, like literally everything I studied, especially from the census, because I'm a geneticist, or not geneticist, I always get those confused, a genealogist. And I see it all the time before she talking about people coming in from here. And I mean, it's obvious that we always been here. It's obvious that you had that element of Yoruba that was already here. It's obvious.
Mhm. Yeah. I actually dig looking at the sequence of things, and what I gather from it is a lot of so-called African Americans really do have that ancient DNA,
Hmm.
Absolutely.
which pretty much says that we are indigenous, and that's not just to America. Technically, we are indigenous to the world.
The
To the
planet.
planet.
Exactly.
Right.
They just
Yeah.
claim in one piece. I mean, that's like having like a big cake, delicious cake, and you just want one little slice when you can have the whole thing.
Right.
Right. Right.
We
I'm
definitely thank you
excited
for
for.
coming on, and we can't wait to have you back because I can't wait for you to go into that Moorish element. I
Hmm.
can't wait because I want to see what you have there.
I have a lot of receipts.
I want to see how it coincides with what you and I have discussed about it.
Yes,
Yeah, I'm
definitely.
anxious to hear that. Well, Dr. Fatu, we thank you so much for being here. Again, we look forward to having you back on the show. We want to thank everybody for tuning in, for being here with us, for sharing in this moment and grasping all this wonderful information and knowledge. Um, any final words?
From me?
Yes.
Oh, I wanted to thank the two of you for having me on my show. I really appreciate it. I enjoy coming on the show and teaching the audience, and I really want the audience to re-listen to it, soak it in. I encourage them to, for those that did their DNA, go back, take a look at it, and I hope that I open their eyes to looking at their DNA in a different way with a deeper
Yeah.
understanding.
Absolutely. We have
Mhm.
people that still look at
I
the last one.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I would advise y'all go look at the last one, then watch this one again, and then wait for the next one because it all goes together, and the information you receive is gonna be profound. So,
Absolutely.
um, you have anything to add?
I just want to thank everybody for coming in here. I mean, there was like 600 people, like over 600 people in here. I told her that people love you, man. They love when you
Oh
come out.
yeah.
There's a lot of people that, like I said, they watched the last one that you had. I get inboxed about when are you going to bring her back to the show? And I mean, here you are. I
Mm.
can't wait for you to come back on. I thank people for see, look at the lady right there.
Okay.
Mhm.
Um, I thank everybody. You could be anywhere else in the world, but you're here with us. Kenny Evans.
Absolutely.
That's a Moorish brother right
Absolutely.
there.
Mhm.
All
So definitely,
right.
I thank you for
So,
you know,
so with that being said, we're gonna say peace to everybody. Until next time, this is Peace Pipe TV with Micco Wolf, Phoenix Nadie. See you guys next Saturday.
oh, you don't want to miss next Saturday. Before we go,
Oh,
we have a. I'm gonna let you say it. I'm gonna let you.
oh, really? We gonna put it out there like that?
Nah, you know what? We gonna.
Just make sure that y'all tune in next Saturday. Look, you know it's serious when you get the clap going. Make sure you tune in. Make sure y'all tune in next Saturday. Of course, we're gonna be advertising, so be on the lookout of what tomorrow or so. We have a very, very special guest coming on to the show. Um, the excitement. I'm excited. I don't want to spoil it, but
I want to say
y'all
it, but
y'all
I ain't
wanna
gonna
y'all
say
wanna
nothing. I
tune
ain't gonna
in.
say
I
nothing.
want to too. I'm trying real
Don't
hard
say
not
no. Don't
to.
say no. Don't say
Oh my
no.
gosh. It's hard. But all right, y'all. Thank you again for being here. We're gonna put this up here again because yes, this
That
was
was
deep.
here.
Until next time, you guys, peace be unto you. Bye.